Well, good morning. I've been thinking about this presentation today with much anticipation, so Dr. Grawe, no pressure. So we've heard a stimulating presentation about AI from Professor Daniel Schwartz and a talk about adaptability from Kurt Zellers. On Monday evening, we heard about the demographic reality of our region from Dr. Susan Brower, and we received a federal policy update from Dr. Tom Harnish. This morning, Dr. Nathan Grawe is going to tell us how we can adapt to this reality and move forward. I have high hopes for your presentation this morning. Dr. Nathan Grawe is professor of economics at Carleton College, where he has served on the faculty since 1999. He earned his BA from St. Olaf College and his MA and PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. If you're noticing a pattern, all private institutions of higher education. His work as a labor economist studies the connections between family background and educational and labor market outcomes. Dr. Grawe is a prolific writer. His 2008 book examined the impact of demographic shifts on demand for higher education and how we, institutions and policymakers, might respond. His 2021 book provided examples of how proactive institutions are addressing demographic change. Dr. Grawe, we've heard a lot about the headwinds that are facing us here in the Midwest, and now we want you to tell us what to do about it. So, with that introduction, please help me welcome Dr. Nathan Grawe.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so Eric's right. I am a private institution product, though my dad taught at a public. And I want to say right off the bat, I think the diversity of our institutions is really the strength of the American system. When I see other systems, there's a lot less diversity than we have. And of course, the public system educates the vast majority of students. And while I happen to teach at a private institution, I think it fits our students well. Obviously, for most students, they find a fit someplace else. And so as I look around the room, I really appreciate what this group represents, as we recognize that even as we are in different circumstances, to a degree, we've got 4-year and 2-year institutions, public and private, large and small, we have a lot in common that we need to work together on. So last night, Kurt said that demographics will put you to sleep. So I suppose they put me here in part because I will start with demographics. You already heard from a real demographer. I'm just an economist, but I think we do have to start with an understanding of how demographics are going to play into higher ed, and then we will talk about how to move forward. I saw a Washington Post article a number of years ago where an admissions officer in the Northeast said, I'm starting to term the mid-2020s as the apocalypse. And I read that and I thought, wow, that is a uniquely unhelpful metaphor. I mean, if you think about it, if it is the apocalypse, there's nothing to do. You just go home and hang out with your family, I guess. So at the end, I'm hopeful that I can give you a more constructive metaphor than that, and having placed the bar on the ground, I think I can get over it. But before we get there, we do have to talk about some headwinds that we face. Just so that we're all on the same page. So we're seeing a shift in demographics. Some of these shifts are really slow and persistent. So we can look at the composition of young people. This is looking at census data in the United States, work by William Frey at the Brookings Institute, who does really, really great work. He's looking here at the tipping point. That is the year where we cease to be a majority non-Hispanic white. For the country as a whole, mid-century, 2045, he figures. But younger generations are more diverse. And so when we think about the generations that our institutions typically serve, we do have non-traditional age students, but typically we skew a little younger. We see, for instance, that those under age 18, well, we've already passed the tipping point. That was in 2020 when we were occupied with something else. We are becoming a more diverse country. There's that shift. We're also seeing shifts geographically with young families on net moving out of the Northeast and off the West Coast toward the South and the Southwest. That tends to amplify some of the things we're seeing in fertility patterns that we'll see in a second, but also the immigration patterns. So we've got these shifts in terms of where students exist in the United States. We've got shifts in the composition. More recently, however, we've seen a more abrupt change related to the number of babies being born. Whoops, I went too far. Oh, very good. So this is looking at map of the United States with the total fertility rate per 1,000 women. The total fertility rate measures how many babies a woman is expected to have over her life cycle, given current fertility patterns. If you have 1,000 women and you want to replace the population with fecundity alone, you need about 2,100 babies, 1,000 for the women, another 1,000 for matched men, and then a little bit more for those who choose not to have kids. You can see here what the world looked like in 2007. This is a little baby boom. For the country as a whole, we were above replacement. You can see that our part of the world, well, we were kind of on the edge. If we look toward the Northeast, we see low fertility rates, very low fertility rates in New England area. That will become important in a second. If we look here, the deep blue states are 10% or more above the replacement rate. The lightest orange is 5 to 10% under. Darkest orange is 15 to 20% under. So here we had a baby boomlet, and we can see that Minnesota and Iowa were more than replacement, and so was Indiana, but much of the Midwest was really in kind of that northeast quadrant of low fertility. And then the financial crisis hit. That, coupled with some other things, have caused young people to choose to have fewer kids. So here we've got CDC data on the number of births since 1975. We have provisional data for 2022. It looks about the same as 2021, so we can add another data point that's not going to be a year of meaningful recovery. We can see since the peak in 2007, we're off by more than 15% in the number of kids being born. This is a pretty substantial decline for the United States, and we see that it comes on the heels of a relatively persistent increase. Now, at the same time that the population was increasing, as we'll talk about in more detail, we were seeing more and more people turning to higher education. So, we were seeing a boom period, and now we're experiencing a decline. And we're about to hit the teeth of this decline if kids get older 1 year at a time, and that's the economist assumption. Demographers ask questions like, how many babies will be born next year? That's a hard question. I'm just going to assume that babies get older 1 year at a time, and we say, okay, those kids not born in 2008 don't show up on campus in 2025. So when we experience this kind of decline, we're thinking that the traditional age cohorts are going to start shrinking in just a couple of years here. Initially, we won't notice it as an enormous effect, but we can expect that the population decline of those cohorts will continue through the 2030s, and on net, we're looking at a 15+% decline already. This is something that will be pretty challenging for us on higher ed if we don't do anything. We can see also that it's cumulative. It's not just one cohort of students that are missing on our campuses. We might think about 4 to 6 years worth of cohorts that are affected at a 4-year institution. Maybe it's 2 or 3 cohorts at a 2-year institution. This is work by Kenneth Johnson at the University of New Hampshire. He's looking at the blue line there, what would have happened had fertility rates remained the same. Instead, we got to experience the red line, and you can see the cumulative gap now is more than 8.5 million missing or foregone babies. And so those are 8.5 million people who will not be showing up on our campuses 18 years later. This is what the country looks like when we look at the total fertility rate in 2021. We can see that the low fertility has still got a geographic component. The red here is our states that are 20% or more below replacement. In 2021, I think South Dakota was the only outlier. Usually I ask anybody from South Dakota in the room, and there may be one hand in a room that's far bigger than this. I'm not going to ask today because we know you got some South Dakotans here. And good work, you all. I also have 4 kids, so I've been doing my job along with you. But you and I are not enough, apparently, to sustain this operation. So we're seeing now these low fertility patterns spread throughout the United States, where Vermont had led the way in 2007 with total fertility rate of 1,715. By 2021, 12 states were below what Vermont was posting in 2007. So we, in essence, all became New England in terms of our fertility choices. The challenge for us in higher education, I think, is pretty clear, and this was evident kind of early on. In 2014, Sarah Lipka, in the front page splash in the Chronicle, wrote, until just a few years ago, colleges could anticipate classes of high school graduates each bigger than the last, but those days are over. And I think it's interesting that she's noting not the decline here. She's saying that we were on this rise and now we're on a plateau before, at this point, you could already see that, okay, it looks like we're going to have a bit of a decline coming. She's saying it's that plateau that's challenging, and I think that's right. That's the paradigm shift. It's not really the decline, it's the no longer growth. Many of us are at institutions where we know when things get tough, we can have conversations that work backwards. What's the budget number we need? Okay, and then how many students do we need to recruit? And when things get tight, you say, well, maybe we can just add a few extra students. And if we look over the last 70 years, you'll see many institutions like mine just slowly, gradually getting bigger. At my institution, I saw a plot that looks at square footage per student. And what you see is we keep coming back to the same number, but the square footage goes down and then it pops up. We grow students because there's a budgetary impact if we do it on the cheap, but eventually we realize, wait a minute, we have to put these kids in dorms and we have to teach them and we have to have a rec center. And so the square footage goes back to what it was, and then we have another tight budget cycle and we add a few more students. But that can't happen when you're in a world of scarcity. When the numbers of students in the corner aren't just going up and up and up, you can't just turn to your admissions officer and say, well, we've got less than best practices going on here. Why don't you kind of paper that over by just bringing in a few students? Now you actually have to confront those less than best practices. And I think we're seeing in the last 5 to 10 years, often bylines out of New England where it's demographically tougher, the consequences of that as we see kind of the stress fractures appearing at institutions that had been getting by we'll just add a few extra students, and now their admissions officers are saying, yes, but we're on the plateau or we're even in decline. So that's the challenge for us. I think it's in particular challenging when we think about the context that we got here. I was speaking with Dave earlier, and the challenge of higher education leadership is that often we face challenges and we can look around and say, well, who was here the last time this happened? Since World War II, if you looked at roughly mid-50s and you looked backward 5 years, you would say, wow, we've got more enrollments in higher ed today than we had 5 years ago. And you could do that in 1955 and 1960 and 1970. Every year you'd say 5 years ago we had fewer students than we have today. We're growing. Every year until 2013. Every year since then, you'll look back 5 years and say we've got fewer students enrolled. We just have not lived this experience in a time period where anyone in higher education leadership alive today has experienced. And so we're flying a little bit blind and trying to find our way in a new environment. So the WICHE folks, the Western Interstate Commission folks, have been putting out these projections of high school graduates. That was the first time I saw this. I saw this roughly 2011, I guess, in a strategic planning exercise. At that point, we weren't really seeing the entire nation imploding demographically, but the Northeast was doing its thing already. And for those of us in selective higher ed, that's a really important market. And so I saw this part of the country, the Northeast quadrant, just kind of going down and thought, I wonder if that is relevant for us at Carleton. And because I've got letters after my name, like many of you, psychologists tell me that I'll have an especially strong ability to ignore new information, right? I've got my priors, and this is not what I want to see, so I can come up with reasons to ignore it. So for instance, Carleton just serves a small sliver of higher ed. Maybe the population is going down, but maybe my students are growing. And we'll see there is some truth to that, but I wanted to figure out, okay, but is that true? Where are we seeing the declines in young people? So when we see the WICHE data, that's high school graduates, that's great, but some of them go to 2-year schools, some of them go to 4-year schools. And so that's what I tried to do, is kind of break out this change in demographic. And so the exercise was to look backwards at recent college-going behaviors based on demographic markers. And then using those probabilities, look at the population we have in the younger generations and just kind of project out. If those college-going behaviors continue into the future, given the demographic changes we've seen, what will happen to the number of people going to different types of colleges? And so that's what these graphs do. In each case, we're looking relative to 2018, so 100% is the 2018 level, so if you see 90%, that means a 10% decline. In the upper left, we have young people with demographic markers that in the recent past have been associated with going to 2-year institutions. Then in the upper right, we have a number of young people with demographic markers that in the recent past have been associated with attending 4-year institutions that aren't among the top 100 colleges or universities in the country. So I call those regional institutions because their demand tends to be quite regional. In the bottom 2 panels, we have young people with demographic markers that have in the recent past been associated with attending more selective institutions. As we look across here, in each case, we've got the 4 different census regions. So we'll just first call out the orange and the yellow, which is the Midwest and Northeast, are not as auspicious as the blue and the gray, the South and the West. That's because 2 things. One, we've had low fertility sooner. We saw the Northeast quadrant even in 2007 was not strong. So there you see them not growing early on and maybe even declining. And then we see a drop in fertility in the mid-2000s, the mid-aughts, and that leads to the decline that comes. So that's true across all 4. I think if we look at all 4 panels, we'll see that the top 2 panels look more like a plateau and then a decline, and then the bottom 2 panels have more of a rise and then maybe a bit of a correction. So what's accounting for that? There are some compositional shifts going on in our nation that actually favor selective higher ed. Maybe most importantly, the access agenda, which frankly is largely due to the top two panels here, means that we have more parents who have a college degree. Parents who have college degrees are more likely to send their kids to four-year schools and to selective four-year schools. And so as we have this really massive success of the access agenda working its way through the system, we have a rising tide for these selective institutions as they have more and more people who demographically in the past have been sending their students to schools like theirs. I think it's worth noting that bottom panel, I don't know that we're actually going to see enrollment change according to this. This might be more what you think of as the pool size. So the pool might be growing. We have seen some institutions like the University of Michigan expanding seats, and they're not alone in that sort of particularly selective class. And we can kind of see why. Well, the number of young people with demographic markers like that has been increasing, so they can expand seats and become more selective. But whether institutions in this class will expand seats that dramatically or not remains to be seen. So we've got this challenge facing us. In the Midwest, I think it's not as bad as in the New England area, but we might prefer to be in the Mountain West at this time period, in part because of outmigration of young families in some states like Illinois, in part because of lower fertility, especially in the eastern part of our region. We can also look at who is in this group. So here I'm breaking it down by race, ethnicity. If we look at the two leftmost bars, what I'm looking at is the recent past, the cohorts that reached college-going age in 18 and 19, and comparing it to a not too distant future in 2033 and 34. The two leftmost bars are just the distributions rather of 18-year-olds. So this is the story you've seen in the news countless times, no doubt. We see the black share, that's the share of non-Hispanic whites, falling below 50%. So we're crossing this tipping point that Bill Frey was talking about. This shift is largely driven by an expanding share of Hispanic Americans, the yellow share in this graph. And so we can see that we're moving toward a more diverse future of 18-year-olds. As we move to the right, we do the same exercise for young people with demographic markers associated in the past with attending two-year, and then the three different subsets of four-year institutions. And I think it's notable that no matter what part of the higher ed landscape you're looking at, we see a more diverse future than we have in the recent past. The black share, the share of non-Hispanic whites, is shrinking. In fact, it's shrinking faster when you look at more selective institutions, which are less representative. Two-year institutions, and only to a slightly lesser degree, the regional four-year institutions look an awful lot like America. So as the population goes, so too go their populations. But we're seeing even faster diversification among the more selective institutions, which are a little bit less representative. If we think about who's driving that diversification, there's a little bit of difference. So at the two-year institutions, because it's driven by the population, it's largely driven by an increasing share of Hispanic students. When we see the most selective institutions in the far right, it's yes, an increasing share of Hispanics, but also an increasing share of Asian American students that drives that diversification. I asked the model, what would happen if we cut the rate of immigration in half? How much of this, in other words, is driven by immigration? And the answer is, of course, it would slow diversification. But you would still find that each and every subset here would be more diverse in the near future than it is today, which I think is just a way of reminding ourselves that the diversification we're experiencing in higher education today is baked into who we are as an American people. Yes, immigration contributes, and we are having a debate about immigration. I don't know if it'll reach a conclusion. It seems like we just debate. But so immigration policy matters, but that's not what's driving our diversification. Not primarily. At this point, we are a diverse and diversifying country, and we will continue to be, regardless of immigration policy. So we have some demographic challenges. We're going to face smaller cohorts, and they're going to be more diverse in particular, leaning toward populations that we are still grappling with, and we've been for 20 years working on the problem of meeting students who don't fit what higher education in 1950 looked like. We're going to continue to have to do that work. We're seeing some other challenges at the same time. One challenge has to do with people's perceptions of higher education, and that relates to the real returns to higher education. We can think about the return on investment, if you will. This is looking at the wages, the hourly wage rates, relative to, I guess it's 2020. This is looking at, so the reference point is the start of the pandemic. But what you can see is that for almost 10 years now, we've seen relatively little growth at the very top end, the 90th percentile wages, but we've seen really fantastic growth at the bottom, the red 10th percentile. This means we're seeing declining inequality, and it's really been quite impressive. Between 2020 and 2023, we reversed almost half of the increase in inequality we saw from 1979 to 2010. So to say that again, just 3 years, 2020 to 2023, reversed almost half of the increase in inequality from 1979 to 2010. This is a big deal. We're seeing at the same time that we've got kind of wage compression, returning stories about unionization. You've probably seen the UAW talks and so on. What this means for us, however, is that we have young people who are realistically looking around at alternatives to pursuing higher ed and seeing, hey, I can get a decent job. It means that whether I don't think they're actually doing the math, but when they experience the math of, do I want to go to college, or how much would I gain from going to college, the return, while as a labor economist I want to note is still very high, is less than it once was. And the feeling might be like, I don't know if college is quite worth what it was. And in some sense it isn't. It's still worth it, but it's not worth it as much as it was 10 years ago. And that probably makes it harder for us to sell some things. This intersects with some other cultural trends about people's attitudes toward education. Brian Kaplan's book titled The Case Against Education is curious to me because inside it actually argues for a high rate of return to education. Basically, his punchline is just not for the reasons that you think it is. And yet the editor chose that title and it sold a lot of copies. I think that suggests something that we might be picking up in the Pew data that shows an erosion of support for higher ed, the perception that Americans no longer think that universities have a positive effect on the way things are going, at least not the same numbers. And while there's a partisan divide on the answer to this question, the trends are held in common, Democrats, Republicans, Independents. We are facing a challenge. Some people point to the free education and the freedom from debt movements and think, well, but they like us, they want to spend more money on higher education. But I would note these are curious ways to spend money on higher education. Both of these arguments sit on a premise that what we are charging is too much for the product that we're selling. The return isn't worth it. So when I see these movements, well, on one hand, it's nice, oh, they like us, they want to throw money at higher ed. Yeah, but only because they don't think that we're doing our jobs. I think there's a tension here that we need to recognize, that maybe we aren't perceived as having the same rate of return we had in the past. And we are seeing evidence in the matriculation rates that maybe people aren't responding to us the same way. Now, we want to note that over this time period we've had, with the exception of the pandemic, we've had some really good economic times with low unemployment and, as I said, wage compression that suggests that, okay, maybe some of this is cyclical, but the wage compression might be more persistent than the low unemployment. We've certainly seen a long downward trend, and that trend didn't start with COVID. We were on a downward trend in matriculation rates even before COVID hit. I think we should also note the downward trends that started in both the Hispanics, that's purple, and even before that, during the Great Recession for non-Hispanic black populations. Our connections to those subpopulations seem to have been frayed in the first instance by the Great Recession. I'm less sure what might have kicked off the decline among Hispanic Americans, but where we had a wonderful success story of convergence, we are now seeing divergence in matriculation rates in those groups, and I think it's a reminder that sometimes when you have temporary stimulus like the Great Recession or like the pandemic, your temptation is to think, oh, okay, so if there was, use an analogy from Glenn Lowry. He said, imagine you're wearing a sweater and you've got a little string and you start mindlessly pulling on it. At some point you look down and realize what you've done and you say, oh, okay, I'm making a mess. Well, if pulling is what got me here, perhaps pushing will get me back where I want to go. Unfortunately, the answer is no. It's a lot more work to put it all back together. So when the financial crisis broke relationships between us and African-American families, maybe because they were disproportionately hit financially and so they stepped back from higher ed, you might think, oh, but now the recession's over and so we just go right back into relationship. And the answer is no. The relationship with that community has been broken. It's going to take a lot more work to put it back together than it took to take it apart. So we've got some challenges. But I'm not here to tell you that it's the apocalypse. I think we can respond. As we think about examples, I just want to put two things on the table. The first is the importance of mission and context. So that's the left. We have to know what's our target. This is just to say that if we see examples up here that other institutions are doing, that doesn't necessarily mean that the institutions that you're working with can just take them off the shelf and plug them in. Context matters, mission matters. These might be great ideas over there, but not great ideas over here. We have to think about that, and we have to trust campus leaders to be attuned to the context in which they're working and think hard about which examples do make sense. At the same time, accountability is necessary, and accountability often means that we have to be specific about our goals. I think about the Institute for Healthcare Improvement and the 100,000 Lives campaign. This was a campaign to implement at hospitals 10 basic life-saving ER techniques. Things that are really basic to do, like elevating the bed of the head, that don't always get done. So the idea was we're going to make a commitment from all these hospitals, and they're going to document their death rates. And we want to, in 18 months' time, document that we've saved 100,000 lives. And they named a date. It was like by June 6th at 11:59 p.m., we want to document 100,000 lives. And they did. They did marvelously. They went on to a 5 million lives campaign, and they failed. But I think it's a great failure, because it was a failure that put a flag in the ground and said, that's where we're aiming for. We're not trying to save some lives sometime. We're saving 100,000 lives by June 6th. And I think there is a need, when we're in the environment we're in, to be serious about accountability, which means having specific goals, not that you always hit your goals, but that you're serious enough about those goals that you'll acknowledge when you fell short and then do a postmortem and figure out why did we not hit our goals. So a little both and here. One place that institutions are looking is outside the US market. Sorry about the font getting messed up there. Outside the United States market, if our domestic market is weak, maybe we go get international students. This data from the Institute of International Education in the yellow shows new undergraduate enrollments. You can see the COVID decline. We've bounced back, but not quite back to where we were before. What I want to call your attention to, though, was the decline that preceded the pandemic. That decline was already ongoing. And if you look at the dates carefully, it starts with the cohort arriving on campus in the fall of 2016. I call that out because sometimes people say, oh, Trump administration policies. And yes, the Trump administration did make it more difficult with visas and so on, but the decline predates that. It took place when we all knew that Hillary Clinton was the next president of the United States, and no one was anticipating the Trump administration, which is just to remind us that there are other causes for this decline, in particular fierce competition from Canada, the UK, Australia. It's not as simple as us just flipping on a light switch and, okay, if we let them come, they'll just be so happy to come. The rest of the world, by the way, is also having a little birth dearth. In China, for instance, in 2016, they had over 18 million babies born. In 2022, under 8 million. A decline of 60%, 6-0, in just 6 years. Now, a lot of those declines in births are probably in the subpart of the population that's not sending to US institutions, but they're not alone in declining fertility, which is to say that this market has its own challenges. Just saw this morning, India is very, very near catching China as the leading sender to our country. So we also need to be thinking about who are our international students if this is our intended response or part of the intended response. All of which is to say, I think international students are an interesting part of the solution here. It has been in the past in higher ed, but I think we got to be careful and recognize it's going to take a lot of work. Related to that, we might turn to new domestic groups. Here we have Pam Ettinger at Bunker Hill, where they have now focused on non-traditional age students. But she warns us that we have to pair this shift in mission with professional development. We have to help staff and faculty understand these new student groups and get beyond questions like, why aren't you bringing me the right students? By which I mean the students you brought me yesterday. So that we can start to think about how can we change the way we work. When I talked to her, she spoke about looking at every single thing they do from the lens of a non-traditional student. So she said, for instance, just start with orientation prior to registration. They were requiring 2 days that you physically had to be on campus before they would accept your check and register you for classes. Maybe it makes sense for an 18-year-old, she said, and I'm not questioning the content that's going on in those days. It's an important process, but we have to figure out how to do orientation in a way that matches somebody who has a job, has kids, who physically coming to campus for 2 days is a real impediment. So we've got a lot of work to do if we're going to become ready to meet new students. And some of that work is going to require us to reconsider our own self-identity. So here's one of our colleges in the Midwest at Drake University. And I share this example not as an example of this is what we all should do. I don't think it's going to happen at Carleton, but I really admire what's going on in their minds as they do it. So they had identified in Des Moines student groups that they were not serving. In fact, no one was serving. And the problem was that these students really needed a 2-year entrance ramp, and yet they weren't being met by existing 2-year campuses. One possibility would have been to partner with those 2-year campuses. I think that's interesting as well. They chose to add a 2-year degree program. Okay, again, I'm not suggesting we all should head in this direction, but what I liked about it was their willingness to consider who they were, their own self-identity. At my institution, adding a 2-year degree would be a very difficult lift because we consider ourselves a 4-year institution. For those of you who are 2-year institutions, I don't mean that as an insult. You can go ahead and laugh at us a little bit, right? I mean, but we all have our own self-identities. This is who we are. And some of those are core to mission, and we shouldn't compromise. But others are just kind of silly, this is who we are. But if that's not who your students are, we might need to reconsider. Do we demand that they become us? Or can we meet them at least halfway and say, I will shape my self-identity a little bit in a way that reaches out to you? And that's what I see Drake doing here. And I think about my own institution and how we need to reconsider how we define ourselves and identify ourselves, and can we reconsider our identity in a way that meets students better. All of these so far are focused on recruiting students, different student groups internationally, domestically. The math doesn't work out super hot, however, for just recruiting our way out of this. 15% decline in the number of young people. How high would matriculation rates have to go? Well, we'd have to increase by about 12 points to overcome the 15% decline, and we haven't done that in short order in American higher education in the recent past. So while I think this is important, expand access, yes, let's do it. Reach new student groups, sure, let's do it. But will that alone get us across the finish line? I think we might want to think about the students who we already are recruiting, and can we do better? Which is to say, can we promote more student success? We have a deep literature on student success, and so we do know how to do this work. So for instance, at the University of Southern Maine, after doing some deep budget cuts that required laying off of staff and tenured faculty, they took a real new approach, which is really an old approach to academic advising. So every student had a 90-minute advising meeting before setting foot on campus to identify, for instance, needs for accessibility services before that first midterm that the student fails. And then we say, oh, look, let's find out what's going on here. You have dyslexia, let's get you support. Why don't we get you support on the front end so that you don't fail that first midterm? At Cal State Dominguez Hills, this looks like mentoring. We're working on a sense of belonging on campus, so the Male Success Alliance. At Rutgers, it looks like using student work as a nexus for advising. So they're training, they've provided a training for student work supervisors in the library, the sports complex, and the student center. And the idea is that these work supervisors are doing weekly pulse checks with students they've targeted Pell eligible kids. So they're reserving jobs for these students so that they don't do retail jobs that might not be as forgiving as some campus jobs, but they're also training up work supervisors with the goal to increase retention among these students by getting them connected to services when, for instance, they might show up to work with a downcast face and a supervisor says, what's wrong? And well, I bombed a midterm. Well, the target supervisor, I'm sure, is a compassionate person. They might say, that's really too bad. But the person on campus can say, that's really too bad, but can we connect you with some services to help you get the tutoring that you need? We might have to talk about academic programming in many cases. We know, for instance, that families and students say that when they see connection between what they're doing on campus and life after, they're more likely to say that their education was worth the cost and was high quality. So how can we make this connection clearer to students so that they see the value of what they're doing and hopefully then stick with us longer and to the end of the degree program? I don't think this means taking disciplines and turning them into something new, but rather it just requires each of us in our own ways to think about what we're doing in the classroom and how it relates to what goes after. And then finally, I want to draw attention to some things that institutions are doing collaboratively. We can do things individually, sure, but sometimes, as this group suggests, there are things that we can do better in partnership. So here's just one example, shared mental health providers. We have 3 institutions, a community college, all of these are in Omaha, the University of Nebraska Omaha, and then the University of Nebraska Medical Center. And they know that they've got a feeder relationship with the 2-year school transferring students to the 4-year program, transferring students to the graduate program. What they noticed was they were losing some students in those transitions, as we do, by the way, throughout higher ed. And in particular, they saw a subset of students were being lost because when they changed institutions, they had to change mental health care provider. And for any of us who's ever worked with a therapist knows, it's hard to find somebody who gets you, and then you do all this work to be understood, and then, oh, because I'm changing schools, I have to go and meet with a new mental health care provider and start all over. Well, that can be really, really challenging for students and be an impediment. So they said, well, since we're right next to each other, why don't we share mental health services? When you change schools, you keep the same therapist. I think that's a great example of thinking creatively about how we might collaborate. We're seeing system-wide collaborations. So the University of Georgia, obviously, has kind of led the way with some consolidations. Maine is doing something interesting where they're now under unified accreditation, which just means their institutions are not being accredited as individual institutions, but rather as a system. This comes with some complexities, but their goal is, if they can be thinking more collectively, might they then share resources across the institutions in ways that can benefit their students. They can share a recruitment network. They can share programs to a degree so that students can take classes across the institutions more effectively. Another example that crosses the public-private is North Carolina two-year institutions. The public two-year institutions and the private four-year institutions have for years now worked on really well-crafted articulation agreements, not just on general credits, but increasingly they've moved into majors. So if you're going to be a nursing major at these four-year institutions, which two-year college classes will we guarantee will transfer into this major, so that not only can you get into this school, not only can you get credits toward graduation, but you can get credits that are fulfilling the requirements of the specific major. So it's a true 2+2 and not a 2+3.5 or a 2+4. I think there's a lot that we can do in that collaboration. So before we open it up for questions, just, I promised a more constructive metaphor. This comes from an observation by Ed Bennett at EAB, the consulting firm. In a blog post, he pointed to Talib's book, Anti-Fragile. And Talib is writing about the different responses that we can have to stress. Most of us recognize that one response is to break, and we know that's not good. And so we tend to think about resilience or robustness. So I think, here comes stress, like a turtle, I'm just going to pull into a shell, let the stress wash over me, and the hope is that I come out the other side unchanged. But Talib's pointing out in this book there's a third response to stress, and that's anti-fragile. You actually get stronger when placed under stress. So for those of you who step on a treadmill once in a while, the idea is exactly that. I'm going to stress my body, and cardiovascularly and skeletally and muscularly, I'm stronger, not left unchanged, as a result of the stress. And so my hope for higher ed in the next 15 years is not that we get to 2045, say, and say, wow, that was a pleasant time for higher ed. I don't think it's going to be an easy time. I think it's a challenging time. But if we instead look back and say, because of the stress, we've expanded access, we've made clearer connections between the academy and student lives, we have higher retention and persistence rates, we collaborate with others so that we appropriately tap into efficiencies and maybe even come up with new degree programs. Well, if we do all of that, I think we'll say we're fulfilling our missions more fully, and we might think that it was worth it if it wasn't easy. So with that, we've got time for questions, and I believe for those of you online, there's someone in the room who's going to be channeling questions from the chat, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I'm going to start with the last thing I didn't finish writing, where you talked about anti-fragile.
Yes.
Would you talk a little bit more about that? Because you said it's beyond resilience and robustness.
Yes.
Okay. Would you talk more about that, please?
Yeah, so I recently took a fall. That kind of stress, I sprained a shoulder. So that's the breaking that I know I don't want. I was put under stress and I broke. The resilience is simply I'm going to be under stress, but maybe I think about the wind against my house and I've got 2x4s. I hope that they're unaffected by this stress. They're just resilient. But when the storm passes, the 2x4s are no stronger than they were when they began. The anti-fragile might be the trees themselves. So we're told that trees that we use for 2x4s, interestingly, are less strong today than they were in previous times because we grow them in rows. And because of that, they don't experience the full brunt of the wind. When a tree grows up getting pushed around, it actually gains strength, and when you cut it down later, the fibers themselves are stronger. And so that's an anti-fragile system where because of the stress, they're stronger than they would have been. If you could have chosen, do I want to expose them to the wind that's whipping the trees back and forth, or could I protect them? You'd say, no, bring on the wind. And I think about my own kids, and I think with my children, I want them to be anti-fragile systems. Yes, I want them exposed to stress. I want them to see failure. I think it's great that my son plays baseball, where if you're lucky, you hit the ball 3 out of 10 times. Because that means 7 out of 10 times he gets to fail, and he gets to think about, okay, so what am I going to do with that stress? And I hope he grows. I hope it doesn't break him, right? So I protect them from some stressors that are too big for them. I don't want them to break. But I don't protect them from all things. Now here we don't get to choose. These forces are coming. But I think we do get to choose our stance. We can choose to just say our goal as an institution or as a system or as a compact is to simply hunker down. Gosh, wouldn't it be great if in 2045 these campuses looked exactly like they do today? And sometimes that's the best you can hope for, so I don't mean to denigrate that. But there is something better where you might say, well, this is going to be interesting. It's going to be a bumpy ride. But could we come out the other end serving our students more effectively? Because there are conversations that are easier to have on campus as we come to faculty and staff and say, look, we got a real problem. The numbers of young people coming are lower than they've been in the past. So we got to retain them a little bit more, or else we're going to have to cut some jobs. And I think, when people ask me, do I think that institutions are going to close? Well, we are seeing institutions closing. Yes, some will close. But I hope it's not anywhere near as many as the worst prognostications are, because I hope we get a bunch of smart people in the room who say, let's work this problem. We can do something here. We can think about how we can serve students better so that we retain them better. We can think about how we can expand access so that we aren't stuck with only recruiting in the same stagnant pools. We can become a better institution.
Thank you very much.
Susan.
Thanks, Dr. Grawe. I have a question for you. A number of the folks in the room here and online are state policymakers. So you've talked a lot about this sort of from an institution or a system perspective. Do you have any thoughts about how the folks here in the room who are state policymakers might think about the work that you're doing?
So my advice there would be to, just as with institutions, my advice to the policymakers would be to recognize that this time is a little different. It's not like some of the enrollment blips that we've seen in the past. So in this area of the world, just north of here, a few hours, there was a wildfire in Hinckley, right about the same time as the Chicago fire, so it doesn't get much coverage. But there's a book by Dan Brown, which is a really compelling history of that fire. This wasn't just a wildfire, it was a firestorm. It created its own weather. It created plasma that went out in front of the storm and then dropped down. It was different. Like entire forests were just popping at once in flame. The people of Hinckley got on a train, they're running backwards down the track, blowing the train whistle the entire way as they pull into Sandstone, the next town up the road. And the Sandstone people showed up at the train station because this is a weird time for the train and it's blowing its whistle, and they see their neighbors with their clothes singed off, hanging out the train windows, begging them to get on the train to save their lives. And many of the Sandstone farmers said, I've seen wildfires before. I'm just going to go back to my farm and protect it. And many of them didn't make it as a result. I think it's challenging for us to deal with paradigm shifts. When it's just a little blip, we go back to the thing that's worked in the past, and our brains are wired to do that. You get the dopamine hit, I do this, it works. This fruit is sweet, I eat it. Great, I'm going to grab that fruit again and again and again. And some of us really struggle with that with the sweet tooth. But paradigm shift is when things no longer work the way they worked in the past. And then if our inclination when we see something different is to go back and do what we've done in the past, we can actually be setting ourselves up for failure. So my concern is we haven't seen a decline like we're expecting in the recent past. And if policymakers say, well, just handle it the way you've done it in the past, tell your admissions offices to be on their A game, that might be a problem. In particular, when we think about our campuses, we have a lot of fixed infrastructure. This is true at privates as well as publics, and it means that we might have to revisit how our formulas work because they might not work the same way in the coming generation as they have in the past generation. And if we aren't willing to have some hard conversations about what are the objectives of these policies, and I don't mean this to just say, throw money at the problem so that campuses don't have to grapple. But if we aren't willing to acknowledge that, okay, these are real challenges that require that we collectively approach them in different ways, we might be dooming ourselves to not be able to take advantage of some of the efficiencies. And the other thing to remember is sometimes radical change has upfront costs and long-term benefits. So when we've seen consolidations, for instance, those always have upfront costs. They do have long-run cost savings, but if you're not willing to cede the process of change, sometimes you can see there's another path that's sustainable and the one you're on isn't, but you just don't have the resources to get to that sustainable path. So I think we have to be open to conversations that are, we're going to do something different. Yeah, Dave.
First, it's a delight to have you here, and I would just put in a plug for your books and your website, that there is so much more information that you have out there that's helpful to us. We heard a very engaging presentation yesterday on generative AI. Have you begun to think a little bit about, because this seems like another significant impact on higher education. I know there's not any data yet, but have you begun to think about if that's an additional stressor on this system?
It certainly is, certainly in the way that we teach. So I've seen two things that were persuasive to me in thinking about how I have approached it in my classroom, and maybe it speaks to how institutions can think about it. One came from Casey Mulligan at the University of Chicago, so both of these will be professors at institutions represented in this group, who pointed out that when we see something like AI, technology that reduces costs, there are two possibilities, and it has to do with how do people respond in their consumption to the decrease in price that's going to follow. So if we think about what happened in agriculture in our neck of the woods, we saw dramatic decreases in the cost, but people don't need more calories, and so they don't change food consumption very much. And as a result, we have far fewer people working on the farm today than we did in, say, 1900. That's what most people think of when they think of AI. It's just going to destroy jobs. But there's another possibility. You might think about the spreadsheet. When spreadsheets made financial calculations decrease in cost, people didn't fire all the people working spreadsheets. They said, oh, wow, we want more of this stuff. If it's a little bit cheaper, I'll consume a lot more of it. And so they hired a lot more people who worked with spreadsheets. And so when I think about AI, I think there are both effects possible. Different parts of the AI innovation will be of that first job-destroying characteristic. So for instance, I've been rewarded over my career for the ability to generate large blocks of text quickly. The supply of that service just went through the roof. Nobody's going to be impressed by my ability to crank out 2 pages in a hurry, because the AI bot can do that. On the other hand, the AI bot doesn't do particularly well with synthesis, given the nature of how current AI models work. So I think I'm encouraging my students to think about, what does this tool do well, and what does it not do so well that I can develop a skill complementarity in, so that I will be really valuable because I'm the one who knows how to harness this thing. And I need to be shifting my investments away from that first category, because nobody wants to pay for that anymore, and shifting them into the second. And I think we can think hard about how assignments can be created to allow students to begin that process of learning how to effectively use generative AI, just like they've learned, I've got assignments to teach students how to use a spreadsheet. You don't worry that it's going to annihilate the need for people who think quantitatively. You're imagining that, if you can really harness that spreadsheet technology, you're going to be very valuable. So I think we need to be thinking about, okay, so what are the skills that benefit, that work side by side? The other economist, that was a Michigan economist, but I guess I'll stop there. But very good. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the next conversation.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Nathan, Dr. Grawe. It was really wonderful to hear your presentation. We've tried to get you to speak a couple times, and we're glad you took the time to join us here in St. Paul. Thank you.